Good evening, everyone. Okay, now we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Okay, now here's a little clarification on that. A good way to clarify verse 1 is this. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me, quote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, end quote. That's what you wrote to me about. Here's what you did. Concerning the things which you wrote to me, which was this. Here's what you wrote to me about. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Okay, that's what you wrote to me about. Now Paul says, I'm going to explain this and answer what you wrote to me about. And so now he proceeds in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 to explain what that means. Verse 2. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Now, I hope we notice something here. Let every man have his own wife. You know, I've had to deal with several situations where men get nutty idea that polygamy is okay, and I've had to deal with it. And I've even had to put people out of the church because they said they were going to practice it. There's nothing in the Bible that says polygamy is right, having more than one wife. And I've always found it kind of interesting. I've never dealt with a woman that came and said, well, I want several husbands. It just doesn't happen like that. But they refer to the Old Testament where you would have the patriarchs having several wives. They weren't converted. That was the custom of the day. They were involved in it in the culture. Once God started working with Abraham and the others, you will find that they had to settle on one wife and one family. We've had to deal with people in various countries where they can have several wives in terms of the requirements of the country. How do you handle that when they come into the church? Well, you just explain you can't have but one wife. So where is your one wife? And they were always able to say she's the wife and these others are wives too, but she's the one. Then he has to be married to her and the rest are going to have to go their own way. That's the biblical teaching. Notice what it says here. Let every man have his own wife. It didn't say wives. Let every man have his own wife. That verse right there completely and totally forbids polygamy. And let every woman have her own husband. Just one. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, due affection, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. In other words, within marriage there is love and there is affection and there's expression of those feelings of love and affection, and that should be done. And that is something that enriches a marriage. I've seen marriages where the people were affectionate toward one another at the beginning, and it gets less and less, and finally they barely even speak to one another, much less hold hands or kiss or show any kind of affection. Well, Paul is saying don't do that. The wife has not power of her own body but the husband, and likewise also the husband has not power of his own body but the wife. Now the wife, she's in charge of her life, and the husband in charge of his life. But when it comes to marriage, you are joined one to the other. You become one flesh, and then you serve your wife, and the wife serves the husband in every way, including with love. Defraud or deprive you not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. It's just saying, don't ignore one another, and don't ignore the affection that each of you need as a husband and wife. Unless you decide, well, we're just going to concentrate now on fasting and prayer for a little while, and then we will concentrate on doing things together and on the affection and love that's there in a marriage. And don't let that go too long without that happening, so that Satan can drive a wedge in there. And he's always trying to drive wedges. That's what Satan does. He tries to drive wedges between husband and wife, between parents and children, between children and children, between families, between church members, between ministers and church. He's always trying to do that. The old divide and conquer thing. And you can't let that happen, and you certainly can't let it happen in your marriage and in your family. Verse 6, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. However, I want to mention something when you read verse 6. Some people read that and say, well, this is just Paul's idea. No. He's saying, there's nothing been written or decided on this matter, so under inspiration of God, I'm now addressing it. And therefore now it becomes Scripture, and it becomes the authority from God on this matter. Because every Scripture is given by inspiration of God. We know the Bible says that. For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that manner. In other words, there is evidence that Paul, especially at this particular time, did not have a wife. Now, it could be that he was a widower. There is some possibilities that he was married at one time, and he knows a lot about marriage here, so it could be that he was married at one time. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. I believe he had to be married to be a member. I can't absolutely dogmatically say he was married, but it's possible that he was married and he might have lost his wife and become a widower. I don't know. But nevertheless, what you're going to read as we go through now certain sections of the Bible is a lot of Paul's judgments on this subject are based on the distress that they were all under at this point in time. He clarifies it, though, if you get the whole picture and if you get it all in context. For I would that all men were even as myself, but every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. Now, he just got through saying, let every woman have her own husband and let every husband have his own wife. He's for marriage, not against marriage. But under the present distress, he's saying it's going to be hard for you to marry. You can, but it's going to be tough. Verse 9, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. I mean, if they're just so restless and they're so uptight and they're so uneasy and they love somebody and it's legal and it's lawful and somebody loves them and it's fine for them to get married, but they're refraining from doing it, but it's putting tremendous emotional stress on them and so on, go ahead. It's better to marry than to be in that state. Other translations here where it says, verse 9, burn, doesn't mean fry in the lake of fire, but just in turmoil and upset all the time. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. Marriage is permanent. It's for keeps. God hates divorce, so once you're married, you're married. However, we're going to go through some godly and biblical reasons for a marriage to dissolve, which God himself put in the Bible. Let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. Now, there are cases and situations where in a marriage it gets so tough and so hard that sometimes a separation takes place, and a backing off and an airing and time to think it through and time to figure it out. And so a separation takes place, and Paul is saying here, if that happens, you have to remain unmarried. You're still bound, or be reconciled. And counseling with the ministry should be involved in all of these situations we're starting to read about here. Verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. It hasn't been covered yet, but God is inspiring me, and so I'm telling you, this is the will of God on this matter. If any brother has a wife that believes not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. In other words, sometimes the wife will be interested in the church and be called in the church, and the husband won't be. And Paul is simply saying, on the inspiration of God, stay married. Just because God hadn't called a husband yet, be a good wife and be married and stay with him. You can be in the church and still be married to him. You're already married. If a brother has a wife that believes not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away, and vice versa. And the woman which has a husband that believes not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. And I've known many cases in the church where the husband comes into the church, the wife doesn't, but they have a very happy marriage because they put into practice what's mentioned here. I've seen wives come into the church, the husband doesn't, but they get along and have a wonderful family life because they put into practice what's mentioned here. They were already married when one or the other came into the church. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. In other words, if a woman comes into church and the husband doesn't, the husband becomes sanctified in the sense of having access to the truth. He sees his wife who's in the church, he sees the light, he sees the example, he sees what the church is about from talking to her, and so he's in a special category of kind of being set apart and having access to the truth. Now, whether or not, and blessings that God pours out on his wife are he's going to be able to enjoy those blessings because he's living in the same house where the blessings are given. When God blesses his wife and blesses the house as a result of the home, as a result of the wife, he enjoys those blessings. So he's in a special category, and so are the children. The children of members of the church, even though there might be only one member, they are holy and they are sanctified and set apart by virtue of God blessing that member and the child receiving blessings and parts of blessings and other things that come with their mom or their dad being members of the church. And so it's a wonderful blessing when there's somebody in a home that's in the church. It's a wonderful blessing for the rest that are in the home, especially if they will recognize and take advantage of those blessings and appreciate them. I personally feel that companies have been blessed because of members that work in those companies. And I've seen situations where a company will hire a member, and the member goes there and lets their light shine and works hard, and God blesses that member, and some of those blessings flow out into the company, and the company begins to prosper. I've seen that. You know, when a member of God's church is really serving God, and God is blessing that member, not only are they going to be blessed, but there's going to be collateral blessings, if I can put it that way. You know, you hear about collateral damage. There's going to be collateral blessings that flow out into others as a result of the blessings that's poured out on that member. They may recognize it, they may not. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in homes. I've seen it happen in companies. And I've seen it happen in marriage and families. Now, verse 15, 1 Corinthians 7. Here was an example of where Mr. Armstrong changed a teaching. Now, you'll see that in the 54 years that Mr. Armstrong led the church, he grew in understanding. But it wasn't too long until God had basically established the doctrines of the church through Mr. Armstrong that stand up until this very day. But Mr. Armstrong will change where he sees he's wrong, but he won't jump too quickly. He has to have proof. He has to see it in the scriptures. He has to see it in terms of wisdom, of logic, of facts. And one of those places where he made a change was Pentecost. For years, we observed Pentecost on Monday. And then it began to be very, very clear, and upon lots of study, lots of research, thoroughly looking into it, Mr. Armstrong saw that no, Pentecost should be on Sunday. And when he saw that, he changed it. And now we observe Pentecost on Sunday. The same is true with this marriage, with this matter of the unbeliever departing. It doesn't weaken marriage. Marriage is still permanent, and it's still to be highly regarded, honorable, and undefiled. But there are cases where the unbeliever will depart. Sometimes the unbeliever will depart, get a divorce, and get married to somebody else. And the member then is not still bound to that person. And so verse 15 makes that clear. Mr. Armstrong came to see that, and he made a change where the marriage can be dissolved in that case. Whereas used to, no, we taught it could not be for anything. Well, for fraud, but otherwise no. It says here, but, verse 15, 1 Corinthians 7, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart, or let her depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So, the unbeliever in the marriage departs, leaves, and gets a divorce and goes and gets married or just leaves and will not reconcile, will not come back. And the wife stays in the church or the husband stays in the church. Lots of counseling, lots of getting the facts, lots of making sure we're doing what the Bible says, but it can come down to where that marriage then is dissolved. Marriage is bound and is permanent for life unless, one, it was based on fraud, and that is based on a lie. Two, the unbeliever departs. Now, the person might have been a believer at one time and then left the church and got into all kinds of horrible problems and would not change and simply would not fulfill the marriage commitment, after counseling and getting the facts, that marriage probably could be declared dissolved, or unless one of the members die. So you see, there are cases where a marriage can be annulled, for instance, or can be dissolved, where fraud is involved, where the unbeliever departs, where rampant immorality takes place, fornication, for instance, as Jesus Christ said, but really the meaning is rampant immorality. And, here the moral person in the church is trying to lead a life of godliness, and the other one's just going around doing all kinds of things and would even bring diseases home, etc. Upon counseling, that marriage very well might be dissolved. Now, the person might say, well, I don't want it to be dissolved. I'm pleased to dwell with you. Well, it takes more than just saying I'm pleased to dwell with you. It also takes actions that demonstrate that you're pleased to dwell with a person. So I'm not going to get into all the details regarding divorce and remarriage. I have been involved in managing and handling those cases for many, many years, and I was in charge of that department for a while when I was in charge of that whole part of the church and the work in years past. So I am familiar with it somewhat. But not somewhat, but I'm familiar with it a lot. But in all these cases, you don't just decide this for yourself, and you don't just up and make a decision and take off. You get counseling, you talk to the ministers, you get all the facts on the table, and then that's where the government of God comes in, and a decision will be rendered, and then what is bound on earth is bound in heaven, and that is you're still bound to that person, or all right, because of this action and that action and the other action, this marriage then is dissolved and you're no longer bound. So that was one of the reasons that now a marriage can be dissolved, which did not used to be a reason. That is, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Verse 16, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether you shall save your husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether you shall save your wife? By your example, by your dedication, by your fulfilling your wonderful wifely duties or your wonderful husband responsibilities. So that's what you want to do. You want to make the marriage work if possible, but not to the point to where it threatens you physically and mentally and emotionally and even spiritually, and the other person won't change. God builds into the discussion the example where the marriage then can be annulled or dissolved, and it has to be handled carefully and properly, but there are such cases where that can be so, and should be so, and is biblical for that to take place. Verse 17, but as God has distributed every man as the Lord has called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. In other words, God holds us responsible for what we know and for what we can do, and with his help, he expects us to do it. Is any man called circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Now, of course, this is not talking about babies here. The Bible doesn't require you to have your little boy babies circumcised. Women were never circumcised, but your little boy circumcised. It's not a spiritual plan or command. But almost any research will show that it's a good practice, on the 8th day, just as far as health and sanitation, etc. But it's not required. It's something that parents should consider for their little boy babies as far as just a physical health matter. If they decide to, then they ought to be careful about it and do it at the right time and have somebody who is qualified and capable of doing it very carefully. That's their decision to make, though, and it's between them and God. And it's not a commandment to do so, but it is something to consider for a baby, and done properly and so on. Many authorities will point out that it's beneficial. And certainly, even though it's not required, it's not forbidden. But here it's talking about people who are adults, and it's not required one way or the other. It says, verse 19, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. Spiritually speaking, that's very true. The keepings of the commandment of God. Verse 20, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Are you called being a servant? Care not for it, but if you may be free, use it rather. In other words, don't say, well, yeah, I'm called, so now I've got to quit being a farmer. Or, yeah, I'm called, so now I've got to quit being a waitress. Or, yeah, I'm called. No, you can carry on being a farmer and a waitress, but you've got to obey God. And if you can move on to something else if you want to, fine. But you don't have to just because God has called you. For you are called being a servant, care not for it. Or, pardon me, are you called being a servant? Care not for it. But if you may be free, use it rather. And there were times, in Paul's day when people were servants and they weren't free to go. Part of the contract was, no, you stay here and you're going to be my servant for X number of years or from now on. But sometimes that can be worked out. That doesn't apply necessarily now, except in, say, if you've signed a contract and maybe that contract calls for you to work on Saturday. Well, you can't work on Saturday. So now you're going to have to get that contract changed or move on. But if it can be changed and you want to stay where you are, fine. You've been called and you can stay where you've been. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. And we are the servant of Jesus Christ. You are bought with a price. We've already read that. Be not you the servants of men, the slaves of men. God doesn't want us to be slaves of men. And that's not the way God sets up his government. And that's not the way it is in the church. And that's not the way it's going to be in the kingdom either. And that verse right there applies to military service. I mean, once you go into the military, you are a GI. You are government issue. You do what they tell you or else. You're not free to just make your own decisions. Then you do exactly as you're told every day, all day. And you are really actually the slave of men. You are under that rulership of the military service, and you will march when they say march, and you will dig a hole when they say dig a hole, and you will fill that hole up when they say fill that hole up. And there's no back talk, and there's no getting out of it. So there's a verse, as well as other verses in the Bible, that point out that as a Christian, if you're in the military, how are you going to be a Christian? How are you going to keep the Sabbath? How are you going to keep the holy days? And how are you not going to be the servant or slave of a sort of men? Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. And there have been some people in the military that were called, and they couldn't get out of the military, but they were able to make arrangements so they could keep the Sabbath, keep the holy days, and stay there a little longer till their military contract was up, work in an office, and then the contract is over, they come out of the military. They didn't have to just go AWOL and be put in prison. It could be handled in a way to where they could obey God in their circumstance and still be there in the military, not shooting guns and whatever, until they could be honorably discharged. And so that's one of the principles that's followed in such cases. Most of the time, people have been able to come right on out of the military fairly quickly when God calls them. Verse 25, Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment, under inspiration of God once again, as one that has obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress, I say, that it is good for a man so to be. Now, keep this principle in mind, for the present distress. Paul is rendering quite a few judgments here that are based on the present distress. They were undergoing tremendous distress. The church and the brethren at that time were being persecuted. They were having a hard time finding employment. They were being run off and out of this city and off their own land and out of their own houses. I mean, they were in tremendous distress. Sometimes there was no place to live. Sometimes there was no food. And everybody was being put under duress. And Paul said, look, for the present distress, it might be better if you remain unmarried. You can go ahead and get married, but you're going to really have trouble under the present distress. It's not that marriage is wrong, but we're in such a distressful situation. Getting married and starting to have babies is going to be kind of a tough time, he was telling them at that time in their situation. Now, we might see God's church in the future be brought under tremendous distress. We do read where when the church flees, it says, woe unto them that give suck in those days, that nurse, etc. Now let's go over here and read that in Matthew. It doesn't say you can't have children, but you got to understand now it's going to be rough and tough, and it could get tough. It says here in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand. We're going to explain that more thoroughly when Jerusalem is invaded and overrun by armies and by Gentiles, and the place where the temple was is an abomination that's done there. And just like they had to flee in 70 A.D., we'll have to flee again. Then let them which be in Judea flee in the mountains, which they did. And let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And when we flee to the place of safety, it could very well be this way. But here's how tough it's going to be. Woe unto them that are with child, pregnant, to them that are nursing. And pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation. So it wasn't just talking about them then. In duality, it's talking about us now. And so that ties in with the present distress that Paul was talking about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 26. And if we ever get into time of, quote unquote, the present distress, some of these recommendations might be made then. Not absolutely dogmatic commands, but you need to think about this. Are you bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed, verse 27. Are you loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But and if you marry, you've not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she's not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh because of the present distress. But I spare you. In other words, I'm not going to hound you about it. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. See, the time is going to come when we're going to say the time is short. It remains that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not. The whole world was turned upside down in this present distress for the brethren in those days, and so will be turned upside down again as we approach the great tribulation. And then, to try to carry on in a normal way is going to be pretty tough. And they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passes away. And if you don't want to be in the world, soaking up the world, and you pass away and dissolve when it's dissolved. And we have to use things in the world, groceries, clothes, go to stores and whatever, but don't abuse that. Verse 32, but I would have you without carefulness or without concern. Don't get all wrought up, but just be careful. Just, use wisdom. He that is unmarried cares for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord in the present distress. But he that is married cares for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. And, here in the present distress, he's having to go out of his way and use extra time to provide for his wife, his kids. And he cares for God. He cares for his church and his truth. But a lot of his time is taken up also with other responsibilities under the present distress. Whereas someone who doesn't have big family responsibilities, he can devote more of his time to God and his work and those responsibilities. So it's talking about ideal situations no longer being the case, and now we're in a present distress. Don't take on more than you can handle, as well as having to deal with this present distress, is where Paul's coming from in this whole discussion. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. She doesn't have children, she doesn't have a husband, so she devotes her time that way. But she that is married cares for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. In other words, her responsibilities with the husband and with the children. But she still serves God and cares for him. It's a matter of allocation of time under duress and under present distress, and be careful about taking on more than you can handle in the present distress, is Paul's point. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you. I'm not trying to confuse you or put a leash on you, but for that which is comely or proper, and that you may attend upon the Lord without distraction. And you can, of course, be married and have children and attend on the Lord without distraction. Of course you can. But when the tribulation starts to hit or present distress starts to hit, and you don't have that, be careful about taking it on, because you may find that you can be distracted, and you will have to really work and be careful about making sure you're taking time to serve God and His work and walk with Him, as well as take care of family. But if any man think that he behaves himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age and need to require, let him do that what he will, he sins not, let him marry. In other words, if there's a time where, a man loves a woman or a woman loves a man, and they're having to really fight doing things that are not right, even in the present distress, go ahead and get married rather than have to just be frustrated and fighting this affection all the time. Go ahead and get married, get that done, and then you can go ahead and deal with the present distress or with the pressure or with the upset that is around us, and be married. Nevertheless, he that stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. No, I'm going to stay single, and I'm going to be a virgin, and I'm going to carry on with my calling. Okay? That's good. No, I love this woman. I want to get married. She wants to marry me. We want to get married, and even though it'll put more responsibility on us, we're still going to serve God and do that. Okay, let them marry. So then he that gives her in marriage does well. See, he's not saying don't marry. But he that gives her not in marriage does better in the present distress, when you're considering the pain, the suffering, the distractions, and the responsibility that they were all under then, and that we'll all be under probably before we flee. So then he that gives her in marriage does well, but he that gives her not in marriage does better in terms of the present distress. So I hope we understand that, because those scriptures we just read through have been so twisted and turned around. And yet if you just keep in mind what Paul is saying overall, then we can understand them. And you keep in mind and get it in context what God inspired him to say. You see, he's not forbidding marriage. You see, he is saying we should be virgins until married. You see that we can be in the church and not be married, and be in the church and be married. But just consider this. You're going to have more responsibility and more pressure if you're married and start having children when things are falling apart. Whereas if you don't, you can devote more and more of your time to God and His way and His work, and then maybe later on there'd be a chance to be married, or if Christ comes, then you'll be in the kingdom anyway. So just keep some of those principles in mind when you're reading through 1 Corinthians 7. Now here's a very important part of Scripture here in verse 39 of 1 Corinthians 7. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Now, see, this ties right in with don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. The meaning of that verse means don't become unequally yoked together with unbelievers. If you're already bound to an unbeliever, make the most of it. But if you're not, then marry in the church. And, of course, if you marry in the church, then you must date in the church, because dating leads to marriage quite often. This verse is so clear. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she's at liberty to be married to whom she will. Better get counseling first. Better be careful. Better make sure that God is going to bless the marriage. Better make sure that he's the one or she's the one. Better go slow, or you can be in a mess. But look what it says here. Only in the Lord. In other words, only in the church. So, if she's married and her husband dies and she gets married again, she must marry in the church. That means she must date in the church, or he must date in the church. So dating should involve people in the church, which will lead to marriage quite often, and that will be between people in the church. How plain that is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 39. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Happier in terms of the present distress. And so that concludes chapter 7. Until next time, this is Charles Bryce with the Enduring Church of God.